firstly, thank you so much, Francois, for getting back to me so quickly, and it's really nice to talk to you. So thank you.
Yeah. You're welcome. Let's say that it's a great opportunity for me to do a podcast. I've been quite a bit familiar with those new tools to explore outreach and send out messages. At least talk to some of the people that might be interested. I'm curious of what I've seen your channel, and I guess it's all about information management and new technologies and trying to. I try to give some perspective from where I'm positioned in the sector, which is so I'm François Baillon. I'm French, and it's Baillon. It's difficult, but it's okay. It's you were almost right.
Almost right. Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, absolutely. So again, for the benefit of people that are new listening or watching to this, yeah, absolutely. The theme is in the background digital and better information management, but the assumed audience are people who are not specialists in this type of topic. So hence why we're going to focus obviously on concepts around humanitarian infrastructure and what we need. So I mean, one of the first things I always ask all the guests, because I'm very lucky in my job now to meet various people from backgrounds, is to ask you to please introduce yourself, what you currently do now, but very importantly, how did you get to do what you do now? So your journey, your career progression to get where you are now, just to show people, particularly starting their career, that there's lots of different starting points. So over to you, Francois.
Yes, well, so I'm the managing director of IHIP. IHIP is a Swiss-based NGO in Geneva. It's quite young. It's been created 4 years ago, and it stands for International Humanitarian Infrastructure Platform. And it's kind of a little team that I'm driving there, and we're focusing mainly on how to help the humanitarian sector to engage with the private sector in construction. So how to deliver infrastructure works and during the humanitarian response. And our entry point is construction contracts. So it's a very special niche. It's how do we harmonize and make people agree on the rules, the construction rules. And this is the job of IHIP so far. Is we've been publishing forms of contract harmonized for the humanitarian sector, dedicated to each of the clusters. So that's one way the humanitarian sector is organized. Is 11 different clusters, which are coordinating each of the different humanitarian sectors to work together and deliver together. And there's about 700 NGOs that are members of those clusters. So it's a big playground with a lot of actors. And a lot of actors which interacts with both the funding side of things, which mainly are public and private donors, but it could be governments, the European Union, American aid, or it could be private funding channels. And at the same time, both international private sector, which might be helping designing and providing solution, and the local private sector at the country level, which will be delivering, constructing, and be what we call the contractor on site and delivering. And the contract, what IHIP does is having like people discussing, giving feedback, and coordinating so that we set up the good rules, the best practices for the humanitarian organizations to work as much as possible with the local private sector. So that's what we do. And I'm not a humanitarian guy. I just got into this sector 4 years ago, mainly driven by the fact that in my career, I'm an engineer. I have an engineering background. I'm an environmental energy engineer, and then I also have a PhD in environmental science and waste management, mainly on underground water. And this was almost 30 years ago. And as soon as I've done my PhD, I had a chance to do my PhD in American University in Minnesota. And I'm saying a sense because this was the starting point for internet to develop and all the digital technologies to emerge. And while I was doing my career, I also learned to develop program and got into a self kind of learning discipline to manage to be able to imagine and deliver and work with digital tools as well. So beginning of my career was more about sustainable development and e-learning mechanisms. So how you train people, companies, using digital internet tools, applications. And this made me a bit of a IT guy. So I have this IT engineering background as well. And I worked for implementing digital solutions for mainly half of my career. And I kept in my toolbox of things all about the environmental science and sustainable, climate smart technologies and design, and how to build and deliver climate smart infrastructure. I worked I was commercial director of FIDIC, which is the International Federation of Consulting Engineers, which in that context both gave me the opportunity to develop digital tools to promote the federation. And the tools, some of them were the construction contracts, but not for the humanitarian space, but for the private sector. But being the engineering voice, a lot of advocacy, and at the same time as well to work on sustainable cities, so smart climate, kind of like green solutions to design urbanization. And IHIP is the result of that experience. Is how do we consolidate, make the best out of what we do in the private sector, and how do we apply those thinking, those technologies, those ways of collaborating. What of this is relevant to help the humanitarian sector to get organized better in order to achieve some of the transformational goals that are on the table, on the roadmap of the humanitarian sector, which is basically facing some number of tensions that are growing, mostly climate change related, which are creating a lot of tension on resources, a lot of displaced population, a lot of crisis situation. And therefore, the answer in terms of infrastructure is growing, both in terms of volume. So we have this more and more population that are concerned and need some answers in terms of infrastructure to address their needs. Humanitarian space is mostly dedicated into how do we help those people to survive, which is a difference with development. That's lesson number one. We talk about the nexus, so how the development sector is the World Bank. Basically, it's an actor of the development sector. We call them multilateral development banks, and there's a group of those, and they're basically funding all the development actions. Development is not humanitarian. You can do development when you have a stable enough governance so that you can have predictable and stable investment strategies. And when you're not in that context, and for some reason it's unstable and there's some security issues, then we're in the humanitarian sector. And unfortunately, it used to be like this linear kind of path where you go from the humanitarian and then development and then to developed countries. And now it's kind of going backwards. You have development countries falling back into the humanitarian space. Ukraine and Afghanistan are two examples. Afghanistan was developed in development, meaning the development actors were present, and now it's the humanitarian actors which are there. And the role, when we talk about contract, is how do we make people work together? And this is where they have to work together for a long time before the project is designed. So how do we use the money that is available from the international community or the local actors? How do we use this to trigger, to decide what we're going to build to address the situation? And that's the design stage. And the humanitarian sector needs to think way bigger than it used to in terms of having infrastructure that will match what I would say, the more people and more complex. That's the other point. So there's more people, more displaced population, but also the issues are more complex because of climate change tension. So less resources, more constraints, and urbanization, which, as an example, before it was kind of we need to design a well and a school in the village, and that was not expecting too much engineering, but now it's all about designing and building up a city in the desert with 300,000 people. So the scale is different. So the story is different, and the tools that the sector needs in terms of how to engage with all the partners are different as well. And this is where IHIP is doing this work on designing the right it's called procurement, So the tools to do to sign, how we're going to engage the money, and on what project, and how do we make sure the quality of those projects are this milestones, and how we reach those targets to go to the next funding level, and how we move from and that's the dream, how we move from humanitarian projects to development projects, and how's the handover, and that's what we call the nexus, how those two sector work together. So maybe tell me. I'm happy to develop whatever in this context.
Yeah, sure.
Just to maybe do the link with the topic. When we talk about sharing and construction and multiple actors, and during a project, there's obviously this question of how do we make the best use of the BIM adventure in the private sector. So building information modeling, how do we share, do we exchange, do we use this digital space, those digital twins, which are very much driving the private sector, and what out of all this is something that can help the humanitarian sector to work together. And this is where I'm happy to develop this unless you have questions.
Yeah, sure. No, I have questions. So thank you first of all. I mean, there's so many things obviously I could pull on, and we could explore not only the engineering, but obviously the digital, and that's sort of the nexus. I know you said the word nexus. I'm stealing the word now. That was the whole nexus of this podcast. Is there's so many different domains, disciplines coming together. I mean, your organization obviously manifests that, but just wanted to explore it if we can. I know you've mentioned, or you've inferred, and maybe you've not mentioned it directly, a humanitarian information model. I know you just said BIM, digital twin, but again, for maybe people that are not necessarily specialists in these type of topics, what do you mean by humanitarian information model, and what information or data do you need in it, and what is it used for? This might be obvious, but can you give an example, I guess?
No. It's not obvious, because that's something, actually, that's a new way of talking about how we use BIM in the humanitarian space. So it's just something that IHIP is developing in terms of concept with BIM partners, which are BIM developers. And of course, BIM is building information modeling, but you have also site information modeling, so SIM. And then it's just playing with the acronym and saying, well, BIM is not, we could say it's a software, but it's not. It's just a way, it's a space to use the digital data, and how we can share that to make sure people collaborate better together. And so this is where we came with the idea, well, the fact that, let's call it HIM, the humanitarian information modeling, to make sure that the end goal is not to use a software, it's not to promote a technology, it's to make sure that information modeling is used for the humanitarian sector to work better and to share. So and from there, it's kind of the concept idea, and then you decline it, and then you have tools, and then you have software, and then you have workflows, way of doing this, and platforms that will kind of be under this umbrella, which we should not forget about the goal. But that's very interesting in the humanitarian context, because the relationship on the ground, both in terms of timing, because usually there's a bit of emergency. So there's not so many people that have the time to train on new platform, new tools, and the emergency, the crisis, the fact that we need to save lives, are kind of making this space between, well, we're happy for progress and new stuff to work and to be there, but it has to be efficient. We don't have time to learn and take the risk not to address something which is happening on the ground. So this is where the humanitarian information modeling is kind of trying to simplify and take kind of the essence of what is being driving this successful avenue which BIM has been taking into the last 20 years. But making this simple means somebody that has only a smartphone and who's not an engineer and has to take a decision on on how where to put solar ovens, if there's room for solar ovens, and not cut the wood which is just nearby to actually cook while putting cook the food to survive, how easy for him it is to explain this, to get the funding to actually get those solar ovens before he can actually, well, he or whoever is managing this is trying to cut the woods, and how cutting the woods might have an impact on the long term, and what's the impact if protecting the wood resources, how this will have a development impact in the 20 years, and how all of this you kind of use the tools to have models and results and dashboards and numbers that can be used to trigger up the hierarchy in the decision process, so that people, all the decision chain that will be involved, have a bit of information that they can trust, saying, well, yes, of course, it's according to scenario 1, we're going to save the woods, we're going to save the planet, it's going to be development, climate change resistance, but we have to invest, I don't know, like $30,000 more now, and this is this week that we have to make this decision. And what I'm trying to say here, and then we need a simplified model of a settlement, for example, which is a advanced camp, which is slowly becoming a city, so it's about urbanization. How is somebody that is not aware, like people listening to us, that we don't have this culture of getting into deep complex software with 3D, 4D, 5D modeling, and making sure you have all your parameters for each of the little individual kind of bricks of your construction project, what we call the digital twin. How we make this simple? How we make this simple enough, but still specific enough so that you can take a good decision. And that's one of the challenges of the humanitarian information modeling, is to filter the best of the technology and make it accessible, simple to any kind of end user which is not familiar with that.
Yeah, thanks, François. No, I completely understand what you mean. It's the information governance framework, or the system. I don't mean technology system. The whole system governance framework, which includes some technology, but obviously you're abstracting it to a higher level. Just out of interest, so I'll just mention, for the benefit of people new to BIM, obviously it does mean 3D in one context, but the other context, which it sounds like you're actually talking about, is the international standards ISO 19650. That's for the benefit of others, which does describe it in the way that you're meaning, this broader system. So just out of interest, what are the main sort of outputs? So for example, you mentioned dashboards. I mean, are the outputs, so the things that people use, they're probably not using 3D models, I would have thought. That might be part of the process, part of the calculations, the analysis, but the outputs are what? They're maps, they're dashboards, or how do people interact with the outputs of what you do typically?
Well, so I'll have to put a bit of a warning there. I'm not a specialist on what's happening on the ground, so I'm only talking. Sure. I'm telling this story with a bit of a distance.
Sure.
And I'm only extrapolating from what I see, because what I see is IHIP is doing a sectorial discussion, so we don't have project on the ground. We're kind of coordinating works between actors of the sector. So UN agencies how do they talk to other headquarters of international humanitarian organizations like the ICRC, which is the International Committee of the Red Cross, and how they talk to the governments and the European Commission to have some kind of procurement framework that will allow all those people to engage with private sector. And so I don't go on the ground and do, like, I don't build anything. I'm just networking and doing discussion.
How do you broker? No, I didn't think you did, François. What I meant was, how do you broker? What does it look like, your service, in the sense of how does it broker or share or exchange information? What do you? I mean, is it literally an information system, or do you produce just the documents that describe a standard, or what are the artifacts that you would use at a more strategic level, or your clients, what would they use? I guess is, Yeah.
So the first thing we've delivered, but back to square one, is we've delivered forms of contract. So that's a document, that's a PDF file, and in that PDF file you have articles and clauses that describe how legally a project is managed through documents, which are the contract, and that's it. It's a 10-page document, and so that's the first output. So there's nothing digital there, but we also so that's what we've done. Now we're working on how, because the contract is the tool that will be legally binding parties to deliver. Around this, you can add different plugins, and the contract is where you also specify the quality requirements, the payment requirements, and then the mediation mechanism. So what happens if there's a dispute? And also the operation and maintenance. So what happens once the project is delivered and the money is gone, and then the project is on the ground, and then how do you make it work? So it's kind of a key element there. And from there, we're adding stuff around this, which we call workflows. And although a contract is a piece of paper, there's also companies out there that are delivering digital environment to host those contracts, and you have online contract management, which will allow different parties to go through that online platform, and then follow up, because under this kind of contract mechanism, they will see the scenario, the story of their project moving ahead. And then in the construction, there's a lot of events, well, depending on the size, but so it's event driven. So suddenly on day one, you have this early warning of like those underground physical conditions that are not expected, and then what do we do? Do we have the money? Do we stop? Do we explore other options? And construction it's a story which you never know how it's going to be. You kind of pretend you know the end. Sometimes you're trying to do your best, but that's the story. What my point is, all of this is also about workflows. So IHIP, and when we're talking about humanitarian information modeling and how to coordinate and the documents, it's the first thing is workflows. In what order do you make sure the right people are at the decision, involved in the decision process, and making sure that whatever decision is taken there is kind of recorded, or we know that this has been taken and it has an impact on the end of the project. And the issue here is more for the different partners, because there's a bit of a turnover in that community, to be able to kind of track the list of events and people and around. So to answer your question, yeah, the deliverable, the output of workflows that you can use, prepackaged workflows that you can use on digital platforms. The most famous one is Trello.com. It's an environment where it makes connection with, and this is where I'm going to talk a little bit. Yeah, information modeling is not only about like engineers talking to engineers. It's also, in the humanitarian context, it's also talking to the local community. And for this, you need also to connect with social media. So how do you make sure that whoever is your community that needs some water network in Ukraine, for example, how do you connect to those people? How do you make sure that they're aware? And you have to use non-technical environments such as Facebook or LinkedIn or whatever, social media, which will allow the communities to identify themselves and to be visible. And how you connect this back to a workflow that will store those actors and make groups and say, well, those are my people, the people that we need to serve, and we need to have them on board and listen, and then design something according to what they know, what exists, and what is kind of expected in terms of outcome in the future. And there you may have documents as well that will, like Google Forms, Google Sheets, archive systems, tracking systems. You can have also as well, we have looking at deals with the contract management platform to have all this kind of integrated to make the life of all those decision process to be as transparent as possible, and making sure you have the right people on board.
Yeah, so it's really interesting because, again, you're giving a very tangible example of this information model or meta model or architecture or data model. I know we're talking about all of these concepts that are conflated, but that's where some people don't sort of get it. That was another driver for me to do this podcast. Information modeling, I often mean what you mean, and a lot of it is this abstracted level, this meta. Things are linked, like a system of systems is what you were referring to in your when you were talking a moment ago, but again, we're talking about that now in an information system level, a system of systems. And you just one question, you mentioned workflow linked to a process. Them triggers, I'd call them event triggers. I think you used the word events. Is that something you have an inventory of? Because that's why I'm really interested in other sectors that I work in. People say, oh, we don't know what might happen. I'll say, well, probably similar things have happened before. There should be a list. It's not going to be, there's not an infinite list of things that might happen. It's maybe a big list. So is that something you have, like a list of what could happen, like a trick, what these 100 trigger events or events could happen? Is that how it works? Is that how you're modeling different scenarios?
Well, yes and no. So there is, all this is coming from the contract management culture. So contract management, if we get apart from the humanitarian space, contract management is about 100 years old in the, well, not 100, but yeah, maybe at least 50 years old. In terms of designing the mechanism to report an event and to make sure when there's an event, there's a dialogue with the right parties and that the risk is identified and the right party is taking the risk on board and manage cost and delays and everything. So the mechanics to manage events is very well described in the way contracts are designed today in the private sector. Because, yeah, let's just as an example, a piece of infrastructure which is worth like billions of dollars. When there is a dispute, the dispute is worth millions of dollars. Well, billion, sorry, no, billion, trillion, sorry, trillion, billion. Anyway, it's worth a lot of money. And therefore, the industry has invented a lot of mechanism to make sure that as much as possible, everything is put in place to avoid the project to go off track and to cost even more to everyone and not to go to lawyers and everything. So this is why you have like early warning mechanism, you have events that will be triggered, and then you have, you have claims, you have variations, and then you have eventually mediation, dispute avoidance, and then adjudication, which are how to solve issues, people not agreeing. All of this is very well described. We're trying to apply them to the humanitarian sector, which was a very smaller project, but as I mentioned, there's some expectation from the humanitarian space to engage with more complex topic. So yeah, more issues to solve. And then in that, back to your question, the list of events itself, we know there's the type of events are kind of, yeah, well known. So you have categories. For example, I was talking about like this unforeseeable physical conditions, underground physical conditions. So we know this topic quite well. How this in the tunneling industry has been dealing with this for ages, and they kind of know how to address this and what are the risk attached to it and how to best also allocate the financial impact to each party. In the humanitarian space, when we're going to dig to there's a lot of underground conditions as well. It's not tunneling, but you're going to do pipelines, water networks. And you're gonna have, when you reconstruct, you need to know in the urban area where you are, what is underground. In Ukraine, you need to know, well, where are the old water canalizations, the networks, and everything. And this is back to the modeling. I'm doing just this analysis because there's also this need to have. It's not just about information theory, but the 3D, the digital twin, is important because in the humanitarian space, there is so a lack of data, of course, and you need. At least the data you might have or people working on the site, they need to be able to share, exchange, and kind of coordinate to have a bit of a vision as much as possible, even if it's simplified, of the 3D representation of the space they're working on. It's better than nothing because there's so many like things, and for the future as well, to have a trace of who's doing what. Because the underground, imagine a city like Paris. There's like, if you dig the ground, there's like 200 years of story of people doing civil engineering works in there, and the BIM is supposed to be the place where you host all that. Anyway, just back to this. Yeah, the events, we know the categories of events, but we're also trying in the contract management to give enough space to be as specific enough so that the event doesn't have to be changed to match a box that you pre-designed. So, but there is a way of dealing with the event and how You notify the event how much time you need to alert the other party for him to react, what kind of paperwork you need to attach to this to to document what you've seen, and making sure there's no fait accompli. And there's also that, you understand this in English, right? Fait accompli. I think no, you don't know. What's that?
Yes, I do.
Yes, it's like force, because the second thing I'm
It's
going to
a done deal, they might
Yeah.
say. Yeah, it's
The
already done.
other important thing is force majeure. So that's another category of event. You know, force majeure. It's a French name, but it feels like this in the English legislation. So force majeure is just an event that will be outside of control of both parties, and meaning like critical, like war situation of flooding or climate connected events. And those events, we don't know, well, there's a bit of, we know it could be, there's a bit of categories, but we know it's going to be a force majeure event. And therefore, in that context, there is also a mechanics of what the responsibility of each party could be or is not, to make sure that it's addressed as a force majeure event and identified as something which is, it's not the contractor's fault. For example, the COVID-19 is a force majeure. So stopping the works to progress, but that's not the responsibility of the contractor. The contractor is the one actually digging the ground and building. It's not his fault if it's delayed. So who's paying what? Do we have to stop the works? Do we have to wait? How do we communicate? So all of this are workflows between parties to have this dialogue and avoid any kind of situation where you'll be, well, you didn't tell me, and I've been there for 6 months, pay the bill. And so it's to avoid those kind of situations where misunderstanding will give space for and kind of lack of trust, and everybody trying to steal out of the other one as making the most out of the opportunity. So that contract culture is not humanitarian. It's been there around for ages. Well, not ages, but a long time. And actually, the UK is driving this in terms of, for example, the contracts to build the Olympic Games. The one in Rio, no, it was well, I have only a few examples, but the London Olympics were like, for example,
in London,
So it's back to the contract and the link with BIM, the modeling. So good contracting will have allow this good process between the partners to make sure there's no hidden agenda, and then there's no space for corruption, limited space for corruption, and that there is informed, shared information. But that's between the two parties of the contract. A contract is signed by two people. And then the BIM, the information modeling, how do you communicate all this to the rest, and making sure that within the humanitarian space, when you're in Ukraine and you're rebuilding Odessa or I don't know what city, there's so many players. So how do you make sure that you coordinate? And that's a big topic of the humanitarian space.
Yeah, and I was just thinking there, I know we've talked about triggers and the process, but the language which tends to come up, this could just be a brief answer, because I suspect it's probably yes, it might not be. Do you talk about smart contracts or so-called smart contracts? Is that language used or not really?
Well, yeah, okay, maybe back to also the role of IHIP here. The humanitarian tradition and culture is mainly being driven by how do we not embarrass ourselves with too much bureaucracy, with too much rules and too much approval steps, because we need to solve something on the ground, and let's have common sense and make sure we're not trapped into let's protect ourselves from liabilities and don't engage because we need this to be signed and this and this and this. So there's a bit of a practical tradition, and the contract is kind of perceived as so far as a very bureaucratic tool, which if we shake hands and if we agree that we're going to do this, we sign a contract because the donor wants a contract, but we're not really going to follow it because we to some extent we're going to deliver, and this trust between us is worth way more than something we will sign. And there's a lot of good. I mean, trust is way better than a contract, but the contract is there to make sure that the trust will not suffer from any kind of misunderstanding. So it's kind of the background tool that will say, we still trust each other, but we don't know who's supposed to do what. Well, in the contract, it's kind of explained. It's like this backup thing which will which would be the rules of the game you're playing, even though you don't want to read the rules. If you play Monopoly, you can have your own rules and go out of the rules. But if you disagree, then, oh, let's go back to the rules. So the rules are there to solve this. But my point is, there's not so many. When you talk about smart contract, it's already kind of an advanced way, educated way of saying, well, what's the difference between a smart contract and a contract? What is making this contract smart? Well, just so we're not there yet. So we talk about contract. and
go on. Sorry, please finish. That's okay.
No. So no smart contract is not part of the. It's not around the humanitarian. Well, a little bit, maybe sometimes it's kind of a niche, but first it's contract is important, and let's have common forms of contracting. That's already, because usually just the contract, and this is where the humanitarian and the UN space they have to make progress. They're using their form of contract their way, and it's kind of country driven. So each country chapter, they have this own authority to do whatever they want in terms of contracting. So the local guy in the country office of an NGO will actually be like grabbing contracts from other example and then building this own form of contract, where usually they will kind of outsource the risk to the other party, and then it will make it very unfair and unbalanced. And then it will say, well, unfair. That's the perception from the other party. We say, well, contract working with NGOs and UN is very risky. I'm putting them together. Maybe I should not, but just to mention that, contracting has been so far not so well acknowledged as being a very strategic tool that you need to agree on and to make the project successful. And IHIP is kind of advocating for this. It's part of the job of what IHIP is doing. So no smart contract yet.
So I just thought I'd throw it in there, because what you were describing before, sort of with the workflows, and we started to even talk about things like event triggers. Using that workflow then for some would be you're enacting a smart contract, but I won't get drawn into that. I was just throwing that term in there for the benefit of people listening or watching, because what you're describing sounds like big elements. Just to pick up another term, I originally have a background in central government, and I part of my day job is to help people get the balance right. Like you've said already, that there could be too little or too much information. Some things could be bureaucratic. Just out of interest, you're using the word contract, and that's quite clear what we mean. But often with governments, I might use the term memoranda of understanding or memoranda of agreement. So something that's not a contract. I don't necessarily want to get into the semantics. I'm not the best person to lead that conversation, but does that term come up? So it's not a contract, so it's not legally binding necessarily, but it's an agreement. This is the principles that were signed up to. Could you just explore again for the benefit of other people that aren't familiar?
Yeah, sure. So the contract is a commercial and legal document, and the contract is something that people sign, and it's something you can go to the court and say, well, I need under this contract to get this money for this and this. It's critical. When you sign a contract, you have to follow the rules of the contract. And it's usually between parties that need to deliver something together, and they kind of know what it is, and then it's over. The relationship is over. Now in the international, in the UN space and the NGO space and the international organization space, as well as federation of private association of private sector, then you sign agreement because you agree to some extent that you will share the same. You've talked enough together to identify that you have common goals and opportunities to maybe develop projects. You're not sure which one, but you're happy to explore. And then you're happy to show to all the other, as an outreach mechanism, you're happy to put your logo together and say, well, we're partners. We share enough of the values so that we can be identified as being part of a sectorial networking thing that we agree to work together. And there's this, so that's a memorandum of understanding. Then there's, depending on the memorandum, but it could be detailed or not, but it will specify the areas where you think you can join forces. And usually in the memorandum, it's not binding. You can stop it like the day you want. You can write and say, well, I don't want to follow the agreement anymore. and then there's no it's legally very weak in terms of implications, and it's just. But for the hierarchy, it means that if you have two complex organizations, like let's take the World Bank and and I don't know, the UK, I don't know, or the European Commission, the European Humanitarian Aid Commission, they decide to work together and explore co-funding on how do we solve the Ukraine crisis, and the two, whoever in this institutions are very complex as institution, to allow the two guys which actually will do the work to work together, they need approval from the hierarchy, and that takes that can shapes into a memorandum of understanding saying, well, we agree to work together, so then the two guys can both wear the caps of their institution and actually share under that agreement whatever it takes to make progress. But it's not a contract. Well, just an agreement.
I just thought I'd add that because it is so critical sometimes. I know it's a very specific sector domain that we're talking about by definition of the organization you represent, but again, generally there can be stepping stones, can't there, for an MOU might lead to a contract. It may not work in the scenario we're talking about today. Just on contracts, just briefly, and again, assuming people are new to these topics, and we were talking about contracts today, which certainly won't be a specialism of most people. You've mentioned FIDIC. Could you just explain what that is? And if there is a link, sorry, just a supplementary, with NEC4, are they linked? Can you just explain what FIDIC is and maybe NEC4?
It's like Coca-Cola and Pepsi. They're just competitors. So they're trying to, they have the same market. It's a market, and it's the contract space, and each of them is competing, saying the other one is not as good as their form, and they're addressing contractual needs with different ways of both. They're different, but they're kind of you're usually a fan of FIDIC or a fan of NEC. NEC4 is the latest version, but that's how they situate each other, and they're kind of challenging themselves in how they're actually proposing standard forms of contract to the sector. So both are proposing standard forms of contracts for construction.
Great, thank you.
It's all about construction. Well, they're addressing also client consultant, but the anchor is construction.
And the links, whether it's with FIDIC, so in NEC4, there's something called X10, which explicitly mentions information management, or BIM in brackets. Is the sorry to put you on the spot because I don't necessarily want you to quote it, but what does it say in the FIDIC structures around sharing information? And I genuinely am interested. How is it structured? How do I specify this kind of information model, this kind of survey? Where is it?
I've not been looking at this specifically, and not to be like 100% sure of what I'm going to say, but and FIDIC kind of issues a new versions of the document, which I'm not so familiar with. But in the past, NEC had a bit of a more advanced approach and more matured approach on how to bring on board BIM impacts in contracting. They were early adopters of this, even though it was not very detailed, because you referred to that ISO kind of regulation. There's other people are specifying how this should work outside of the contract. The contract is not so much you need in the contract to be able to share the risk and make some risk allocation between parties, and you need to specify what will be the role of a BIM manager and how all of this will kind of what kind of impact it has. I will just say that FIDIC is not really too much into incorporating the BIM impact. They're a bit late on this, and they're not so much. They don't have so much this angle of being flexible, which NEC is more of a flexible tool that you will allow to kind of design according to your context. My 2 cents advice on between FIDIC and NEC. FIDIC is very good because it's kind of a standard which has been around for a while, and there's a lot of jurisprudence on the different scenarios you can encounter within your own jurisdiction worldwide. and it's solid. You cannot go wrong with FIDIC, but it might not be, and that's the thing, flexible enough to make the most out of a contract for your project. And this is where NEC enters in. NEC will be way more flexible, but because you can customize it as better, more than FIDIC, to match your contractual, design the better contract that will match your project, but you need to be way more experienced in what the contract is for, not to make mistakes. And both parties need to be aware of what a contract is for. So if your contract culture is shared amongst all the parties and is very well advanced enough, NEC will be a best bet. If in your project you can see that some of the parties or even yourself are not literate enough or mature enough or experienced enough into, well, why should I do this in a contract, and why is BIM like, how do I? It's not, if you don't understand all the mechanics, FIDIC will be safer.
Yeah, great, thank you. And that, again, that wasn't necessarily a loaded question. I'm not suggesting I favor either, but I think it's good people are aware of different options. Half of the challenge is being aware of different things, isn't it? Like that's again the point of this podcast. I realize I'm probably coming towards the end of my time with you. I could literally talk all day on these things, but I know you'll have to go. And but I just, one thing, if I could ask, it's what do you see as the three, and maybe quite brief answers to some, maybe we can focus on these in a different session, but what do you think the top three challenges are for you and your organization? So as summaries, so it might, again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it might be lack of standardization of something. But what are the three big things that you're focused on at the moment? Yeah.
Well, I think it's also an issue with the dynamic of having this digital platform space all together. There is quite of a challenge. It's a kind of civilization challenge at the moment. I can see is we have the same point. On one side, we have all these new technologies, ways of doing things, which are allowing us to have a networked, centralized way of sharing information. All of this very network dependent. So there is this dream of have everything being like having its own little digital twin. So a digital twin will be this place where you have the representation of a site, and there's only one, and it's there, and everybody can plug in and get data and contribute. And it's kind of, because there's one, it's matching the reality well enough so that we can see conflict. But so then, and there is a big avenue there to look like that's the future. And at the same time, there's a lot of tension about, but all this like very networked society system going to resist to climate change, stress on resources, displaced population, lack of water, of energy, of cheap energy. So very challenging thing on the ground, which is kind of threatening this kind of global networking vision. So the money at the moment, the money which is supposed to so the money from the humanitarian space is coming from like the donors, which are saying, we're going to help, we're going to support countries to develop and to consolidate out there, and it's going to be better. It's something that is challenged because, we can see that crises are more and more not only out there or in the humanitarian countries, but it's kind of climate change is changing the game, and the war in Ukraine as well. So there might not be that funding mentality anymore to have this global vision. So there is a challenge between this global technology that is developing and the fact that on the ground politics and reality of resource allocation is just not taking people. There's the digital dream for people on boats trying to migrate from a country where there's nothing to eat to Europe is that they're not going to dream about BIM. So there is this tension now on this. So that's one point. Which is connected to funding as well, and to how much we can, how much we need to go. And I say that's my second point. complexity, like going into high level detailed modeling with very difficult kind of platforms to understand a lot of like options into softwares to finally do a 3D model. All of this has to move in order to be move away from complexity and get simplified enough to be something that the non-techie aware people, although maybe educated in it, they can engage with the logic of using a 3D model online and putting data in without having spending like I don't know, like 10,000 euros on training. That's not going to work. So the industry has to, in order for this to solve the problem of the humanitarian, be part of the solution for the next civilization design. It has to be simplified and cheap, and and make sure it's public domain as much as possible. And this is where connecting with social media, for example, is just saying, well, how do you make all this connected, or how can it work to like this grandma having this own garden and the house, and they need to contribute to I want water, then she's not going to get into BIM logic. So how do we get there? So that might be the second challenge, is how do we, because if it's not simple enough, it's just going to be lost. And the third point might be about collaboration, ownership of decision, and making sure that each actor has a limit can see the border of its role, leaving the other person to have a role as well. And this is something I've learned, like at the NEC conference last week, is we want to make sure that for example, the project owner is not going to design the project. He's going to have on board the people, the end user, and listen to what they want, and the design will be the result of their discussion. He's not the smart guy who's going to design the thing. And he's got to give enough autonomy and enough power and decision-making power to all those people, which we need to identify, to make sure that, it might not be the super smart, sexy solution that is going to be where the engineering services are going to be using this as iconic projects to make more money afterwards. But it has to be designed to match the users and whatever context is there. So that's another trigger. And the UN system and the humanitarian organization, they also have to learn that they have to listen more to the builders, the contractors, the early inclusion of the contractor in the process. And it's not because they have public money that they only have to take the cheapest solution as well. So that's another thing. Where's the quality? Where do we put the money to make sure that we have a good project, even though, it's more expensive. When you go and see a doctor, sometimes you have to pay the price to have the good solution. So that's the other challenge, which is kind of shifting around. It's the power is, I will call it this way, it's more collective intelligence than owned by one party. So that's a shift as well. Which is into BIM. BIM is all about sharing data and collective decision.
Absolutely, because one of the interesting things when I teach the international BIM training is I'll say, well, when you get the information or the data or the information models, then you need to do something with it. That's the other thing about making that decision or that Sorry, just to pick up your point on collaboration there. It's all the effort can't be put into just acquiring data and information systems. There has to be, like you're saying about that, having that connected, pragmatic, practical, user-centric approach to what you do with the information, or that's missing the point. So I completely agree with you. We're going to have to summarize, because I literally could talk all day on this. It's a very interesting topic from so many angles for me personally. But just for the benefit of people perhaps new to these themes, where would you recommend people can go to find out more? What online resources do you recommend, or papers or websites?
Well, this depends what your angle is, huh?
Exactly. I don't know, but based on what we've talked about, I guess, the technology was there, but I think generally this concept around, I guess, digitalization helping with humanitarian response, I guess.
Yeah, this is where it's a very there's very poor. If you type BIM and humanitarian works, you will do find, for example, how can BIM help during the earthquake response in Syria and Turkey. You have like PhDs, you have like people that work on this, but it's a very specific sector on how do you practically put data into a BIM model that will allow you to kind of simulate the earthquake response. But here, the philosophy of the humanitarian information modeling is way bigger than just this. And to be honest, this is where why IHIP is working on this, and myself as well. It's not been very much explored and detailed. So we talked about HIM. HIM is something we've invented like 2 months ago. So it doesn't exist. If you go chat, it's very bizarre, but I typed this in Chat GPT and he knows. and I'm not sure why, but yeah, humanitarian information modeling. So I don't have, it's different topics. BIM, all the literature on BIM is not going to be talking about humanitarian issues. Yeah. If you go on humanitarian issues, humanitarian principles, community engagement, there's a lot of literature there. If you go, well, the ICRC website in general is very well. ICRC is a leading agency in terms of being in the middle of UN system and international NGOs, and their ICRC is a very good entry point. That's about the humanitarian space, but there's a bit of documentation on building information modeling, but I'm not sure it's public, but there's a lot of ICRC, community engagement and all this. That will be the point. Then you have, if you go on the ICE, of course, the Institute of Civil Engineering and the NEC, you have all about contract, and you go to FIDIC as well, FIDIC.org, and then if you want to know more about the cluster logic, you can go to the Global WASH cluster website, or the shelter cluster, the global shelter cluster. Each of the cluster, they kind of have there. And then you have working groups, and then in those working groups, you have documentation. Construction practices, the construction standard guide on the shelter cluster working group, which talk about how to best manage a construction project and the role of a contract in there. So the resources on the shelter cluster on this. Quality, the role of quality assurance into delivering infrastructure works. In the global WASH cluster, it's called the AQA initiative, AQA, accountability and quality assurance. But those are very niche topics, huh? But yes.
Yeah, but conceptually they might, people can, well, hopefully transpose the concepts onto different domains as well. Right. That's what I find a lot of people don't. I find so even if it is based on whatever subdomain it is, I think they're still great for reference sources. And just a very brief answer, if I can. So again, my background originally is in GIS, geographic information systems and mapping. So of course I resisted asking directly about GIS. But just as a very brief answer,
I can tell you.
How does GIS fit into this? Is that something you talk about?
Yeah, well, GIS is a strong source of information to feed BIM models. So this is where you're gonna agree on what kind of geospatial references you wanna use, and the grid and the reference you're gonna use to feed GIS, which in itself is gonna feed whatever modeling you have and digitalization platform. But also it's also another thing where okay, maybe a point there is BIM is kind of taking the spotlight, and GIS is kind of feeding BIM. And so it kind of, well, this is my perception now.
It depends who you ask. I won't disagree, because also you've mentioned digital twin, again, for the benefit of people listening or watching, where there's all these terms, and for me it's always been a continuum, but for some it won't be. So
so GIS, well, spatial data are there and we need them, and there's a unique, it's called GIS, and then you have your modeling, your space modeling of whatever, and there's the GIS community and the consolidation of the standards to work together makes this a solid resource to develop whatever. Whatever in terms of you don't have to you don't have to call it BIM. You could, but the standards are there, and that's a very strong asset for the for us, for the construction sector, but for the decision making as well, decision makers. For example, nature-based infrastructure, it's also an approach which they're trying to say, well, how, back to this forest example, how do we, it's more a regional approach, more than local, but how do you design a response in a country where you have to consider environmental resources and trying to include nature as a contributor to the solution, and therefore preserve the nature. So you want to put that into the model. And shape interaction with other part of the system. So it could be the economic system, the touristic, the access to water. And in there, you do have they don't talk about BIM, but they talk about GIS as delivering the resources that will feed this representation that they're based on to actually do this modeling and simulation on how those nature-based infrastructure will behave. So my point is, to answer your question, GIS is there in the background. Depending on who you're talking to, it might be kind of hidden by another buzzword, which at the moment is kind of taking the light, but it's feeding a lot of different systems and ways of how digital modeling can actually have a real anchorage on spatial grounds that are not fake, and you can say, well, that's on the planet and it's here and we have the coordinates, and that's spatial data, and GIS is there, of course.
Great. Francois, I'm going to have to end it there because I've had my time with you, but that's a great place to end. That wasn't a setup, by the way, that you finish on saying how critical GIS is, but nevertheless, I guess that's something you like. So. That's where we finish. So so that'll be. I know a few people that will be pleased with that. But thank you so much for your time and your insights and spending the time to share what you do. And I'll link. I'll obviously provide the links for your organization and the other link resources that you referred to. So thank you so much, and thank you again. So François Baillon.
Merci, à bientôt, Steven, and hello to all the listeners of the BimTube.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for downloading this episode of the BimTube podcast. Just a reminder that you can access all the podcasts in video and audio if you visit bim.tube. So our website again is at bim.tube.